It can turn day into night, wreak havoc at a sporting event, and spark a horrifying series of blind collisions, a weather incident as seemingly harmless as fog. Citizens of Hamilton, Ontario, are well accustomed to the low-lying smog that covers the cityscape. The morning of September 25, 1950, brought surprisingly clear skies to southern Ontario, but what soon followed stirred panic in thousands of residents across the city. Teenager Charles Moeller and his friend are leisurely driving around the Hamilton streets in a 1936 Oldsmobile and enjoying the sunshine when suddenly darkness shrouds the sky.
It was a beautiful day, top down, and lo and behold, it was getting darker and darker and darker. Street lights were coming on, so we knew that something was really wrong. We really didn't have an explanation.
They drive to the edge of an escarpment overlooking Lake Ontario and Toronto in the distance. Before long, both the lake and the skyline vanish as they become enveloped by darkness.
The view of Toronto just vanished, and that was really, really strange. And then from then on, of course, we had to drive with our lights on. It was that dark.
Elsewhere, in the small town of Waterford, 8-year-old Eileen Middlecoop gets ready for church.
I got dressed and walked to church and noticed how it was dark. It was eerie. It was really, really scary. And of course, with no computers and no knowledge of what was going on, nobody really had any idea what was happening. But I remember being very, very scared, and the old folks were quite nervous and scared too.
Churches receive record turnouts in the wake of the blackened sky as God-fearing sinners seek atonement. Sensing something unnatural, dogs howl apprehensively at the foreboding sky. Horses grow restless. City birds are soundless.
You know, back in previous centuries, one of the frights that a lot of people had was the fact that daytime would turn into night, these dark, dark days. And one in sort of relatively recent history of these events occurred back in 1950 in southern Ontario. And it was one of these Sunday that was pitch black. There were actually special or sermons given Sunday morning to talk about this strange situation.
With the images of Hiroshima not yet forgotten in people's memories, citizens fear the worst. A nuclear war has broken out.
This is shortly after the end of the war. I remember people asking or saying, "Do you think somebody dropped a bomb?" Or is there an eclipse going on? It was gradually darkening. But with an eclipse, it lightens up. But this didn't lighten up.
It was almost eerie that the fact that they were describing this. Is this an eclipse? Is this a Russian smokescreen? Is this a nuclear attack? Is this the end of the world? There was even a baseball game between Cleveland and Detroit in Cleveland on that Sunday afternoon. It had to be played with the lights on, the first time that ever during the daytime.
In some parts of southern Ontario, such as London, the sky reportedly takes on a disturbingly greenish hue, as witnessed by Mary Jean Waters.
And it suddenly got darker and darker and darker. It was actually a funny color, more than dark, night dark. It was almost a green dark.
In the Hamilton area, the sky turns dark red. Fascinated by the phenomenon, 12-year-old Dan Ford and his older brother walked down the street together.
It was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and the whole day was dark. The sky had a red tinge, and I'm walking up the street with my brother.
The red haze not only evokes anxiety in people, but it also offers a perfect opportunity for aggression, as Dan Ford and his brother soon find out. Lurking in the darkness, two teenagers suddenly appear and accost the boys. One of the teenagers picks a fight with Dan's brother. Shortly after, he retaliates, Each of the aggressors pulls out a switchblade.
I remember that day to the day I die because of having the switchblade pulled on me. And I remember seeing it kind of glowing in this reddish tinge.
Outmatched, the Ford brothers make a run for it, managing to escape unhurt.
Everything had a reddish glow to it. It was just an eerie day.
The answer behind this meteorological mystery lies in, of all things, a natural disaster occurring several provinces away. Raging forest fires in Alberta turn out to be the cause. In fact, it is the largest fire in northern Alberta's history, with flames ravaging over 10,000 square kilometers. The resulting column of smoke reaches high into the atmosphere, where the jet stream carries it as far as Holland, nearly 7,000 kilometers away. What Hamiltonians feared to be either a nuclear war or an eclipse is but smoke and ashes.
Smoke and dust can make for some pretty spectacular sky scenes. Actually, the colors that we see are basically a reflection of how light is scattered.
The sky sometimes appears blue because the small particles in our atmosphere scatter mostly short or blue light waves. Larger particles, such as dust collected near the horizon or smoke from forest fires, scatter more of the long or red light waves. Once people become aware of the actual cause of the red haze, they begin to make light of the situation. One minister downplays the unusually high attendance at Mass, stating, "It takes more than a little smoke to get sinners to church." The Hamilton haze catches residents off guard, but it is not the last time Hamiltonians are blindsided by the weather. The Hamilton Tiger Cats participate in a Grey Cup game that becomes truly gray. For over half a century, Canadian football has been a nationally treasured pastime. Each year, fans cheer on their favorite CFL teams as they compete for the Grey Cup, a trophy initially donated to amateur football by the Governor-General, Albert Henry Earl Grey. The end of November is usually the time when two remaining teams square off for the coveted trophy. There is another rival, however, that occasionally decides to take part in the action. Rain, wind, mud, and snow are all a defining part of the CFL tradition. In fact, some Grey Cup championships are remembered more for the inclement weather than the performance of players. In 1950, 8 inches of snow melted on Toronto's Varsity Stadium, turning the grassy football field into a 110-yard pool of mud. Conditions were so terrible that at one point in the game, a referee had to rescue Winnipeg's 260-pound Robert Tinsley from drowning face first in a mud puddle. History would remember this Grey Cup as the Mud Bowl. Among these Grey Cups that have become famous for weather-related reasons are the Ice Bowl and even the Toilet Bowl.
There was the Toilet Bowl, played here in Toronto, and it was famous because of a rainstorm at halftime that just caused everybody who was headed to the washroom to have problems. And it so impressed the Premier of Ontario at that time that he said, "Enough's enough. We're building a Sky Dome. We're building a dome stadium." And that weather event, that Toilet Bowl, if it hadn't occurred, we might still not have the Sky Dome.
But before Toronto's sports became protected by the Sky Dome, weather was at its height of contention in the historical Grey Cup of 1962. Saturday, December 1st, at the Canadian National Exhibition Stadium, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers take on their long-standing rivals, the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Hamilton's corner linebacker, Zeno Cars, recalls the pre-game excitement and weather conditions.
On Saturday, we took the bus back over to Toronto. It was a gorgeous day. The stands were filled, the bands were playing. It was a pretty good day.
High-spirited celebration has always accompanied Grey Cup fever. About 200 revelers are arrested for intoxication the night before the game. The 1962 Grey Cup Championship gets underway before a sold-out crowd. Hamilton starts out as strong as their wall of steel reputation suggests by sacking Winnipeg's star quarterback Kenny Plain for a 7-yard loss. They continue to have the advantage when slippery conditions interfere. An exchange of kicks leaves Hamilton in possession at their own 29-yard line midway through the first quarter. Hamilton continues to dominate with an impressive drive by Garney Henley, which ends with the first touchdown of the game. When the quarter ends, Hamilton 6, Winnipeg no score. The game proceeds, but during the second quarter, the weather brings a new twist in the game. The Hamilton Tiger Cats lead 6-0 at the end of the first quarter at the 1962 Grey Cup game against the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. But weather soon presents another challenge to both teams on the field, as Blue Bomber and MVP of the game, Leo Lewis, recalls.
The fog really it started rolling in. The fog was now down on the field, right down on the field. And it was very hard for the players to see.
It was warm weather, warm air coming across Lake Ontario, and it created the ideal conditions for fog. And the entire city was shrouded in fog for a good amount of that week.
Players know they will have to contend with even more interference than they are used to. Despite the fog, the Blue Bombers come alive with a touchdown of their own, courtesy of Leo Lewis.
And you could see the fog starting to come in. You barely could see anything. In fact, much of the time, where you were on the sidelines, you could not see the players on the other sidelines.
Thousands of discontented spectators above second-row seats anxiously try to make out what is happening on the field.
People in the stands can't see what's going on down the field because the fog is, there's a sort of a cloud of fog about 20, 30 feet high. They were very upset, and I can understand why. You just don't pay all that kind of money to go to a game and then not be able to see what was going on.
Among those in the crowd are Ed Miller and George Hitzroth, two CFL aficionados, commonly known as the Grey Cup Greybeards. They've earned a name for themselves for their loyal attendance. Combined, the two men have attended 122 consecutive Grey Cups.
It got to the point where you could barely see the players. It was that bad. Just like a ground fog.
Well, everyone was wondering, what are they going to do? I mean, and saying, did you see that guy? Where did he go? The guy with the ball. Well, he just disappeared into the fog,
Even the broadcast announcers have a hard time giving the play-by-play of the game.
They must have had a nightmare. I would think that because you really couldn't see. If I can't see it as a player, I'm wondering what you can see from up in, because in C&E, their television cameras are way up on the boxes.
The television cameras couldn't see what was happening, and sponsors were paying money for the broadcast. So they wanted to see the whole game, of course.
Using the fog to their advantage, Winnipeg's Plain hands the ball off to Leo Lewis, who earns his MVP status by startling both crowd and opposition with a long bomb into the fog. Amazingly, the pass connects. The successful convert brings the score to Winnipeg 14, Hamilton 6. Both Hamilton and Winnipeg use the fog to their benefit, bypassing their opponent's blinded defensive lines to score easy touchdowns. The flurry of three major scores in less than 4 minutes puts Winnipeg at 21 and Hamilton at 19 at halftime. The halftime show is seen by few. During the second half, the fog had lifted to a point where once again the fans could see the field and follow the progress of the game. But as soon as playing resumes, the fog makes its way back quickly towards the action. But this time, Better prepared on the Winnipeg 36, Zuger tries for Beatty. Touchdown. The Ticats in the lead for the third time. Hamilton 26, Winnipeg 21.
I'll never forget, there was a player named Dave Beatty that caught a pass and scored a touchdown. I accused him of picking the ball off the ground because I don't think anybody ever really saw it. You could not see literally 10 yards in front of you. And then it got worse and worse as the evening wore on.
Mosca, one of the most feared men in CFL history, struggles to find tackle targets.
They couldn't see very well. They're just trying to get a piece of you. Like, there's no way I was going to get Angelo Mosca. I never went near that guy.
Hamilton's lead is short-lived as MVP Leo Lewis scores another touchdown for the Bombers. From a referee's point of view, the fog adds a frustrating element to the game because it allows some players to get away with unsportsmanlike activity.
Well, you get a lot of complaining, you know, because so-and-so's doing this and so-and-so's, but you get that normally anyway. But in this fog game, we were getting a little more of it because it felt, well, nobody's going to see me here anyways.
The heavy fog makes long passes next to impossible. One of the most talked about stories of the game is when Winnipeg's Kenny Plain mistakes referee Paul Dojak for one of his teammates and accidentally tosses him the ball.
There were so many incidents that took place there that were humorous, and Kenny Plain used to tell a story that he used to fade back and fade back and fade back, and the fog was so thick that he threw the ball to me.
Punt returners fumble for a bouncing ball that suddenly appears out of the mist.
You couldn't possibly catch a punt. Impossible. So you had to listen when the ball hits the ground and try to determine where it's going to go. And football in its oval shape can go anywhere.
Players wonder why, despite the blinding fog and the number of bone-crushing injuries, the game has still not been called off. Some attribute it to the fact that this was the first CFL game broadcast in the United States.
The game was just a total disaster. And I have my theories. I think that CFL, to reap the benefits of whatever they did to sell that game to the U.S. networks, had to play a certain amount of minutes to guarantee the monies, and that's how we get caught in the trap of playing that game.
Finally, with 9 minutes 29 seconds left in regulation time, the game is at last called off.
Sid Halter and we just says, well, we can't play any longer. That was the decision making. I couldn't see from the far hash to the down markers.
We went into the dressing room thinking it was only going to be a slight delay until the fog lift, and we'd go back out and finish the game. About 15, 20 minutes, maybe up to a half hour went by, and they came in and said the game's called. We'll finish it tomorrow morning.
We stayed in some sleazebag motels because you could not get a room available. We had to come back and pay 9 minutes and 21 seconds. And I'll never forget, Bob Minahan and I said, listen, let's go downtown to the parties. We can play 9 minutes standing on our heads. You know, there must be 5,000 cabs in Toronto. We flagged down a cab, and the 3 coaches were in the cab. We were going the wrong way. They said, get your butts back to the room.
Despite themselves, the players returned to take to the field on day 2 of the 1962 Grey Cup Final, the longest game in CFL history. Although this time the weather conditions are only 15,000 spectators show up to watch the remaining 9 minutes, 29 seconds.
And they didn't have time to clean the uniform. You put on your old sweaty stuff from the day before. It was a bit unusual.
I think one of our quarterbacks was limping. One of our defensive backs couldn't walk. Oh, we were just limping around out there on that Sunday.
And he really didn't feel like you want to play the last 10 minutes.
After all the waiting and 21-hour suspense, not a single point is earned by either team. The score, 28-27 in favor of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, still stands. The Blue Bombers rejoice around the Grey Cup not only because of their championship victory, but also because they participated in a CFL game that will become a football story remembered and retold for decades.
Fog Bowl. Wow. Couldn't see a thing.
I've been through blizzards back in, I think it was 1964 when we had our big blizzard here in Winnipeg. I've been in that fog bowl, I've been in wind bowls, I've been in floods of the century here in 1997. I've had some great experiences over my years living here, not only as a citizen, but with the Winnipeg Football Club.
Fog was the most visible player of the 1962 Grey Cup game. But Fog hasn't always been playful where football players have been involved. In another incident, Fog wreaks havoc in a much deadlier form. On December the 9th, 1956, a Trans-Canada Airlines plane in Vancouver is cleared by air traffic control to depart for Calgary. The aircraft carries 3 crew and 59 passengers, including Harold McElroy, a prominent businessman, and 4 members of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, including guard Ray Cernick. They are returning to Saskatchewan from the East-West All-Star Game. At 6:52, 50 miles west of Princeton, just beyond the town of Hope, the captain radios air traffic control to report his number 2 engine stopped and that he's turning his plane around.
At that point, he lost significant altitude, roughly 500 feet, in a short period of time, and was down to 19,000, and having difficulty holding at 19,000.
But at 7:10 p.m., Flight 810 calmly reports it will descend and hold to 10,000 feet, an elevation cleared by air traffic control. 11 minutes later, the plane crashes into Mount Slezzy at 7,600 feet. What happened in those few minutes is a mystery. The crew was somehow oblivious to the fact that they were several thousand feet below their cleared flight path. Friends and relatives of the crash victims are grief-stricken when they read the next day's headlines, including Cernick's little 8-year-old cousin.
I look up, and halfway up the stairs, my mother's standing there and she's crying. And I'm shocked by this, what's happened. And then my father is standing there and he told me about the plane crash and so forth.
A large-scale search operation for casualties and wreckage is immediately conducted, but none of the RCAF aircraft or ground search and rescue units turns up any signs of the crash. There is little choice but to delay their efforts until spring.
In May, they resumed the search again because they waited for the snow cover to start melting.
Another constant obstacle interfering with the RCAF search and rescue operation is fog. Poor visibility holds up units for weeks on end. Eventually, the searchers abandoned their efforts. With warmer spring weather, the snow melts, but the fog remains on Mount Slezzy, except this time it decides to aid the search for the wreckage. On May 12, 1957, 3 top-notch mountaineers set out to climb the main peak of Mount Slezzy.
At about the 4,500-foot level, they encountered a cloud layer. And as they were moving through the cloud, they inadvertently took the wrong gully, which led to the 3rd peak, not the main peak, as Elfrida, who was head of that party, had anticipated.
They find a piece of paper from the flight logbook and a piece of wreckage, which they carry all the way back down the mountain. It is determined to be a fragment of the ill-fated flight. The 5-month-long mystery of where the plane ended up was at last over. A helicopter pilot later spotted remains of the aircraft embedded in the cliff face of Mount Slezzy. Any attempt to recover bodies from the top of the 3,000-foot ledge would be suicidal. Attorney General Robert Bonner of BC declared Mount Slezzy the perpetual cemetery of Flight 810.
Now we can lay to rest, and there was a funeral memorial service in Redwater, Alberta.
Ray was one heck of a guy as a friend. He was honest, caring, a good ball player. It was too bad he was too young when he passed away. If he just could have kept playing another couple of years, he would have been an all-star.
The cause of the plane accident still remains a mystery. Experts speculate severe icing and turbulence may have been responsible for the aircraft's low-altitude collision. On the day of the crash, the weather office informed the pilots they would encounter a trowel or cloud of warm, moist air in their flight path.
There was a lot of cloud. Yeah, basically from 1,500 feet, I believe, to 20,000.
One theory is that the moisture in the trowel may have cooled more rapidly than expected, leading the pilots not into a cloud of warm air, but ice. Instantly iced, the plane plummeted, could not regain altitude. Just as easily as fog can perpetrate a plane accident in the air, it can also cause mayhem to over 100 motorists and passengers on the ground. As part of the NAFTA Superhighway, it's one of the major trade routes connecting Canada to the U.S. There's nothing strikingly unusual about Highway 401, but those who often travel between the cities of Windsor and Chatham, southwestern Ontario, well know the reputation this stretch of the highway has earned. Dubbed Carnage Alley, Killer Highway, and the Bermuda Triangle of expressways, it is a stretch that has had more than its full share of accidents over the years. No one is exactly certain why this leg of the highway is cursed with so many traffic-related casualties each year. But what happened Friday, September the 3rd, 1999, was something for which no one traveling along Highway 401 was prepared, including the McLemore family, beginning their holiday-long weekend. Charles, his girlfriend, and his children Mark and Marcia are en route to Detroit, Michigan. To all appearances, it is a beautiful, sunny morning, but the weather, having a will of its own, decides it will aid the killer highway curse in an eerie way. Commuting to work that morning, Windsor Star reporter Veronique Mandel notices something very unusual making its way across the cornfields.
There was this really strange fog that was rolling in over the fields because we have wide stretches of farm fields. And the way the mist was rolling in, it was almost as though it was a silvery blue. It had a very strange hue, and it was as though it was suspended and rolling.
At the Chatham ambulance station, John Jacobs sits unaware of the horror soon to come.
Approximately 5 minutes prior to the initial calls being received, the OPP had passed that specific site, and it was just as clear as could be in that particular morning. It was just a beautiful morning that started out, and within 5 minutes the visibility was down to zero. It was just something that came from nowhere and blanketed the entire area.
That something that came from nowhere descends on Jackie Gomes, an ambulance paramedic on her way home from work. In a matter of seconds, the mist completely envelops her, eliminating all visibility beyond the front end of her car and reducing reaction time considerably. Somehow, the off-duty paramedic manages to avoid a stopped car that lies ahead of her as she swerves safely off the highway.
I was lucky that I didn't have anybody really that close behind me at the time. Although a car somehow followed me through my little path, and I don't know where she came from. But I'm glad she followed me through because she survived it as well.
A few moments after she gets out of her car, a rig smashes into the automobile Gomes avoided moments ago. Had she not responded so swiftly, the impact of the transport slamming into the other vehicle would have claimed her life. But rather than stop and dwell on her near-death experience, she immediately begins to assist Douglas Wade Brown, another crash survivor. What happens next will vividly remain in her memory. A fog descends on Highway 401, reducing driving visibility to practically nothing. Paramedic Jackie Gomes, having barely avoided an accident herself, assists a wounded crash victim by the roadside. When the unbelievable happens. Another vehicle collides into the truck that almost killed her, followed by another, and then another, triggering a vicious chain reaction of crashes.
While the crashes were occurring, I could only hear them. I couldn't see what was happening beside the immediate area where I was, where a transport truck had literally climbed up a vehicle. And as each crash occurred, especially with the force of a much larger vehicle, it kept pushing things further. Even somebody who had been hit was hit over and over again. All I could do was see what was there and listen. And you knew how hard it was. You had glass raining on top of you with every crash you heard that was close.
Despite her state of shock, Gomes continues to aid the wounded victim. Her colleague John Jacobs is one of the first emergency personnel on the scene.
Well, I've lived in this particular area all of my life. I was born and raised in Essex County. I've been involved in ambulance services for over 30 years and responded to a lot of accident scenes and a lot of catastrophic incidents, but I was never experienced or expected to see what I saw on my arrival at the 401 incident.
The most haunting sounds of all are not the shattering glass or the clanging metal, but those that come from victims trapped inside the mangled heaps of metal. Although the victims are concealed by the fog, their moans and cries make their presence felt in the void. Kirk Wallstead, a resident of the nearby community, appears on the scene and helps rescue trapped victims.
The image, I guess, that sticks out most in my mind is just the sounds and of the people, the screaming, the cars and the trucks crashing into the other vehicles. The people that were hollering for help. Some of them we could get, and some of them that we couldn't. But those sounds stay with you.
Among the trapped victims pleading for help is 14-year-old Marcia, pinned between two vehicles.
Perhaps the story that we'll all remember forever, and the one that probably hurts everyone the most, is the story about the young teenager, the 14-year-old girl who was trapped. And she was screaming for help and saying, "I'm only 14, I'm only 14. And there was one man who was the closest to her car and saw her and heard her.
This man, Peter Weiss, relentlessly attempts to free Marcia. During this time, Provincial Constable Kevin Armstrong is dispatched to the scene.
There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was sunny, it was hot, humid already for 8 o'clock in the morning, and started to drive to this big accident. Well, I can hear the radio chatter, and I'm starting to think, this is pretty serious. As I'm driving to the scene, I drive into fog. Just out of nowhere, it's foggy. And when I drove into it, I couldn't see the front end of the car. It just disappeared.
Peter continues to try and help Marcia. The crisis intensifies when a transport's fuel tank ruptures and explodes, setting the entire area ablaze. Marcia's car is one of the vehicles engulfed in flames. Braving the fire, Peter still persists in trying to save her.
For someone to be trapped and crying out to you, and you not being able to get to them, I think that is probably the most horrendous thing that a human being could ever have to face.
Finally, Peter Weiss is held back. The heat, too much for anyone to bear, puts an end to his rescue attempt. He can do nothing except listen helplessly to her cries.
And when I was there, she had died. Any manner of death in a collision is often horrendous, but to burn to death and while you're pinned is just beyond words.
The screams just got dimmer and dimmer, and they just eventually died out, the screams, until it was as quiet as I guess as it could be. But there was still a lot of fires and a lot of commotion and a lot of things taking place, but the screams had stopped.
When the pocket of mist clears, the total magnitude of the 82 vehicle pileup is at last revealed. It is time to hospitalize the wounded and recover bodies from the wreckage.
This collision was most difficult to piece together in that the collision scene is approximately 1.4 kilometers in length. You've got 87 vehicles, 30 of them are tractor-trailer units or commercial motor vehicles, pickup trucks, straight trucks, and the rest are passenger cars. It just was something out of a movie. It wasn't real. It was a whole bunch of cars on fire. You get up, you can actually see the outline of some human figure who are deceased by this point in time. And you start thinking to yourself, is this real? Is this not a dream?
Minutes after the 1.5 kilometer fog bank lifts, it leaves behind mass wreckage and a highway inferno. The eastern limit of the 82 vehicle pileup is the most concentrated area of the accident. Traveling west bound to Windsor, close to 30 vehicles caught fire, many of which were reduced to ashes. As a result, this area is what officials called the hot zone.
The hot zone was just a mess of twisted metal. Cars and trucks fused together by the heat, burned right down to the frame. So how do you put that together?
The actual highway was on fire. That's how hot the big god, and the pavement was even burning. So it was spread out for almost a mile on between a couple of the concessions on 401. But it was bad. I mean, it took them 2 or 3 days to clean it up, and then they had to repave part of the highway.
John Jacobs is still surprised at how miraculously low the death count was, considering the extent of the fog's aftermath.
There was cars on fire, there were trucks still burning, there was vehicles in the midst that were unscratched. And as you looked around and you saw the horror of it all, I think that to have 7 fatalities in such a horrific ordeal that took place that morning is unbelievable.
Equally unbelievable is the amount of emergency help that crash survivors offer one another. Farmers and other local community members also volunteer to aid emergency personnel for what relief they can to the victims.
We got to see the city of Windsor and the county of Essex, the citizens, come forward without being called to pitch in. We had people bringing sandwiches out, cold water, cold pop, coffee, bringing their own vehicles out to help transport the injured. The spirit of Windsor and Essex County just made you proud to live around here.
With almost every tragedy comes tales of brotherhood, and this highway disaster is no exception. Constable Kevin Armstrong remembers one story in particular that involves a truck driver and how he saves 2 people's lives. The truck driver urges a man and his daughter to exit their car, anticipating that another vehicle is bound to collide into theirs. Moments after they walk away from their Honda Accord, they hear the chilling sound of another car slamming into theirs at full tilt, pulverizing the car. Had the truck driver not warned them, they would not be alive to tell their story. Later that afternoon, the man and his daughter meet with Constable Kevin Armstrong at the police station.
Well, this truck driver who I just interviewed is down the hall. And they said, do you know where this truck driver, do you know who he is? Do you have his name? I said, just a second, hang on. We finished the statement. I went down the hall, made sure he was still there. I said, come on with me for a second. Took her and her father down, and there were lots of hugs and tears. But that's the kind of thing that kept us going throughout all this. Seeing these people who had helped each other come back together again and kind of share their grief, share their happiness of being alive.
Douglas Wade Brown died 2 weeks later as a result of complications caused by the injuries he received in the crash. But this extra time to live would not have been granted had it not been for Jackie Gomes.
Just the fact that he had survived that impact, and he had some very serious injuries and was able to be talking to me and maintain his level of alertness throughout. You encounter that on a day-to-day basis, but it meant a whole lot more to me that day because I think getting him to the hospital alive was probably the only good thing about that whole day for me.
The natural phenomenon responsible for the Highway 401 disaster of September 3, 1999, was the result of radiation fog, a type of fog that forms when ground air is humid and the Earth's surface cools, thereby causing the air's water vapor to condense. This process often occurs on clear nights when Earth's radiation or heat escapes into space. What made the isolated wall of fog even more unusual was how it appeared out of nowhere and dropped so suddenly on unsuspecting motorists as if deliberate. Its only target was that fatal stretch of road.
I don't believe the people at the weather office at the airport had any indication that it was coming, but I'd never seen anything descend so fast and leave so fast.
There was people that have lost members of their family in the accident that will come down to my father's farm and go to the site on 401, stand alongside the highway. They put wreaths, and there's one fellow that put up a large wooden cross in memory of his daughter that was killed in the same accident as well.
I have a lot of respect for the weather, but I also have an acceptance of the weather and a fear of the weather, because I think it's a formidable foe. And it can be such a marvelous thing. It can make you feel fabulous and warm and wonderful. And it can turn on you, whether it's a fog or a tornado or a snowstorm, how your life can be changed.
Although fog is a relatively common occurrence of the weather, sometimes it can surprise us with unusual behavior. The Hamilton haze of 1950 causes a nuclear scare and mass hysteria. The Toronto fog of '62's Grey Cup creates major interference in the most important game of the year in Canadian football. High-altitude fog plays a hand in the mystery of Flight 810. And the Carnage Alley fog of '99 crushes 82 vehicles and claims 7 lives. The more fog blinds us, the more we see how the weather in various forms can have a significant impact on our lives.
Yeah.